Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for this Google Hangout on projecting where the fight against ISIL could go. We encourage every one of you to submit questions via Twitter. You can tweet or mention New America or use the hashtag ISIL Hangout. Today, we have two experts joining us, Brian Fishman, who's a counterterrorism research fellow at New America, and a fellow with the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and a philanthropic engineer with Palantir Technologies. You can tweet at him at Brian Fishman. Doug Ollivant is a senior national security fellow with the New America Foundation and is a retired Army officer who served as director for Iraq at the National Security Council during the Bush and Obama administrations. He's currently working on a book contrasting the surge periods in Iraq and Afghanistan. To get us started, let me ask the first question. The New York Times 2 hours ago published a new article on its website titled ISIS Advances in Syrian Border Town of Kobani Despite Airstrikes. Doug, could you give us an update on the developments on the ground?
Well, it appears now that the Islamic State has pushed inside the borders of Kobani, despite some airstrikes. I'm not sure I would describe them as extensive airstrikes, but some limited airstrikes on the periphery of Kobani. This is an incident that I think shows some of the tensions that we're going to be dealing with as we try to put together this coalition to fight the Islamic State. You know, the Turks are opposed to the Islamic State, but are neither willing to use their military force to go across the border and fight ISIL here, although they've been asked to, nor are they willing to let the Kurds cross the border. There are a number of Syrian and even Turkish Kurds on the Turkish side of the border who would love to go into Kobani and reinforce, but the Turks are preventing them from doing so, because the Turks who live in Kobani are from the YPD, which is the Syrian Turkish faction that is affiliated with the PKK, which is a designated terrorist group, Kurds who are fighting against the Turks. Meanwhile, it's unclear why the U.S. didn't use more air power. This is we've all seen it on TV. This is wide open desert outside the town. This is a place where air power would have very few limitations. But for some reason, be it politics or inefficient bureaucracy inside the military, or perhaps international politics, the Turks asking us not to, it's not clear. For some reason, we've not used U.S. air power in a decisive way to keep ISIL from attacking this town. Brian?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I think Doug gave a great summary of where we're at. But the point that jumps out to me about this incident in Kobani and the difficulties in general with creating this coalition to counter ISIS, this represents, I think, one of the really great failures of American counterterrorism policy since 9/11. One of the key efforts after 9/11 was to essentially build an international consensus that the instrumentalization of jihadi organizations like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, was unacceptable. That doing these kinds of things, whether it's by the Saudis or any of the Gulf states or the Turks, that this was something that was beyond the pale. And that idea, which seemed to be gaining steam, even with the difficulties that we had in Iraq while there were American troops on the ground, over the last couple of years since the Syrian civil war kicked off, has been thrown away completely. And states across the Middle East, including Turkey, have tried to instrumentalize jihadis for their own purposes. And this essentially takes us back in a diplomatic sense to a pre-9/11 period where there is no great norm against working with, or at least utilizing for your own ends, jihadi organizations. And that's a real failing that is going to haunt us for years to come, both in terms of how we deal with ISIS, but with jihadi organizations in other parts of the world generally.
Right, and just to follow up, we saw a great example of this. There's a Daily Beast story 3-4 days ago about how our Free Syrian allies were complaining they'd not been coordinated with when we were dropping bombs. And they're like, look, you've dropped a bomb only 200 yards from our headquarters. Well, it turns out we put it with pinpoint precision right on the al-Nusra headquarters and took it out as we intended to, which just happens to be 200 yards, from the headquarters of our nominal allies. So we have to ask them, why are you only 200 yards from the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria? The answer, of course, is to coordinate with them all the time. So this just goes to show just how Byzantine and complicated the politics of this entire region are, and how difficult it is going to be to herd these cats in this anti-ISIL coalition.
For those of you who just joined us in this hangout, we are speaking with Douglas Ollivant and Brian Fishman, two experts at New America. My name is Timur, and let me continue with a question that we received from Shira Frankel, who's the Middle East correspondent at BuzzFeed. She tweeted, "I've yet to meet a single person in DC who can tell me what the final goal is with the US-led campaign against ISIS. Vague ideas are mentioned, but no one knows how the current airstrikes are meant to reach a goal or what that goal is. So the question is, what is the goal of the United States in their fight against ISIL?" Doug, why don't you answer first?
I think the goal of the United States is the defeat. We hear all kinds of words, degrade, destroy, but I think defeat is probably the most accurate term. But, politicians use these terms, and they don't use them with definitional precision, and that's okay for a politician. But I think defeat is the goal that we're working towards. And I think the plan is for us to do this in stages. I think we are still in the opening stages of the U.S. campaign to defeat ISIL. I think that we're nibbling around the edges, so to speak. We're waiting for, I think, 3 events to happen before we really move into the comprehensive campaign to throw ISIL out of Iraq. We'll get to Syria in a minute. We're still waiting for a Minister of Defense and Minister of Interior to be appointed in Iraq, so we have Iraqi command and control of their security forces. We're also waiting for the U.S. division headquarters that's going to go over there and provide the U.S. command and control to get into country and get set. And finally, a point that escaped me until a couple days ago, we're still waiting for a U.S. commander to be named for this effort. Who is the commander for U.S. forces supporting Iraq and Syria? That's not been named, and it appears to me we still have war by committee, as we have yet to power down to some individual in Iraq and put the hat on him. We know who the commander of all U.S. forces in Afghanistan is. We don't know who the commander of all U.S. forces in Iraq is. So I think we're waiting for those 3 events before we move to our next phase and work with the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga, along with a lot of U.S. intelligence, air power, coordination, synchronization, lots of back office support from the Americans, for the Iraqis on the ground to push ISIL out of Iraq. I think this is a plausible plan that could work. There are no sure things in military operations, but it is a plan that has a good chance of working. I think what this does is gives us more time to work on finding a solution in Syria, because no one knows what the solution in Syria is. In Iraq, we have ground proxies that we can work with that have a democratic government, loosely speaking. It's not a very good democratic government. It's not a very democratic government, but it's a reasonably democratic government that we can work with that does have a working security force that can move forward. In Syria, we have none of these things yet. I think we're still waiting for events on the ground to move in Syria so that we can try to find the right proxies there. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way the president has framed this, of course, is to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. And I think it's absolutely true that sort of the airstrikes that we're doing now can degrade ISIS to a point. It's going to take that coalition with the sort of the interim metrics that Doug described in Iraq to create the political and military mechanisms, really the ground troops that can actually push ISIS out of Iraq. But what I worry about here is that when Doug pointed to this difference between how policymakers refer to and use the word defeat and how sort of technicians or professionals like Doug would use the word to defeat when dealing with an organization. And I think that's really important because I think that there is a broad misconception in Washington about where ISIS came from before the Syrian civil war. There still is this deep-seated misconception that ISIS came out of nowhere, and that is not true. It's simply false. But you hear it repeated over and over and over again. But when you go back to 2010, 2011, just before the Syrian civil war, ISIS at that point, according to the U.S. military's own numbers, had 800 to 1,000 people. That made it one of the largest jihadi organizations in the world, and it was probably the most deadly of any al-Qaeda affiliated organization, even at that time. And yet we considered it defeated in a technical sense based on the counterinsurgency strategy from, represented most dramatically by the Surge and the Awakening movement. And so what I worry about is that, while I agree with Doug that defeat in the sense of denying ISIS the ability to hold territory and threaten governments is probably the most reasonable sort of policy outcome here, right? Rather than sort of destroying wholesale, because that's extraordinarily difficult. That said, we thought we had defeated them in 2006 to 2008, and yet they were in a position where they could come back in a very powerful way relatively quickly when given the opportunity in Syria in 2011. And that vacuum, that policy and sort of security vacuum that the Syrian civil war created, certainly allowed the group to grow in very dramatic ways, but it wasn't, there was a lot on the ground. The reason why it could grow so fast was not just that security vacuum, is that it had the infrastructure in place to take advantage of it. And what concerns me is that if we have a strategy essentially to push them back to the place that they were in 2010, then we're inviting ourselves into another scenario like this one 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And I think that's why defining that policy end goal is so difficult, because to say that we are going to destroy this organization is almost sort of absurdly optimistic on any sort of reasonable time frame. But to defeat it, at least in the sense that we have used that term historically with this organization, it worries me that that's not going to be good enough, and that's sort of not based on what the president has said. I think that's not what many Americans expect. So I'm interested, Doug, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but because I do think this language difference between what professionals would say when they think about defeat and what I think the average American and what even the average, sort of policymaker and journalist and sort of wonk in Washington would mean when they say defeat is different, and I think it's really important.
That actually builds on a question that we received from the Ballston Spa High School, where students ask us, what is the best long-term approach to stopping ISIS? So this builds a little bit on what you just said, Brian. So Doug, maybe can you elaborate a little bit more in terms of what that would look like and how to best approach this in the long term?
Okay, immediately we have a military problem in Iraq and then in Syria that needs to be defeated. And the U.S. can help this through air power, but our position is pretty clear that this needs to be solved on the ground by local forces. And I think that's the right holistic way to look at this. If you look at it from a purely military view, which by the way is what generals are paid to do, that's their job, then it makes sense for U.S. forces to go in. Although, as I tell people, if you want to look at this from a purely military view, the way to do this would be ask the Assad regime and the Iranians to come in and take care of it, because they have lots of forces and they're closer. But all of these are bad ideas politically. The right political answer is a suboptimal military answer, and that is using these local forces on the ground that are not as capable as U.S. forces, that can't do what U.S. forces can do, but are local to the place and don't develop antibodies and don't have massive second and third order effects from introducing them into the area. So that's the first piece. I mean, longer term, there are root causes to Al-Qaeda, ISIL, other extremist jihadi groups that need to be dealt with. The rise of violent Islamism in the first place, the role of these authoritarian regimes throughout the region that give no legitimate outlets for political dissent, the role of lack of economic opportunity for the Islamic youth bulge or the Arab youth bulge, the large groups of not only unemployed but largely unemployable young men. All these are things that are going to have to be dealt with in the longer term to reduce the appeal of groups like ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and its other affiliates. But immediately, there's a military problem that's going to have to be dealt with.
For those of you who are watching us via the Hangout, and if you would like to submit questions, please use the hashtag ISIL Hangout. And let me move on to a question that Patty asked on Twitter. What are the real expectations from Turkey really acting in the coalition? And I think this question is particularly urgent because of the recent clashes that we saw between some of the Kurdish protesters and the Turkish police. Brian?
I think it's hard to rely on them very much at all. You know, Turkey, like every other country in the world, is going to act in its own self-interest, and I think they still define that, or they've defined that for years in terms of limiting the threat from some of the Kurdish actors, both in Syria and Iraq. They have better relationships with other Kurdish organizations, primarily in Iraq. But you know, has also been kind of a tacit alliance between some of the Kurdish elements in northeastern Syria and the Assad regime, and Turkey has come out very strongly advocating the overthrow of the Assad regime, and so you know they're caught in this position where ISIS right now is fighting against a primarily Kurdish factions that Turkey worries about because of their own Kurdish population that has been restive at times and at times, you know, pursued nationalistic goals of their own, and that has at times collaborated with the Assad regime, which Turkey has said needs to go. And so, you know, you're in a position here where Turkey is watching two elements that it has defined as enemies fighting. And so within that framework, it's easy to understand why Turkey sort of wants to sit back and let them fight. But that perspective is, in my view, very much at odds with how we define our national security interests, and rightly so, focused on ISIS. And so we're not going to be able to escape all of these inconsistencies within the coalition. And the danger is that we seek to solve these political problems with primarily military tools. And while you know, at least from what I infer from what Doug was saying, and Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but that there are opportunities, especially around Kobani, to use air power with more effect, I think that we probably should. But we should be wary as we do, you know, to make those choices in a tactical way and not pretend that we can make up for the political failings of our coalition with increased military strength or the increased military power, because over the long run that's not going to work, and it's going to require competent political actors on the ground in both Iraq and Syria to control territory, to govern effectively. That's the only way. That's the only way counterterrorism really works over the long run. Is you build competent government. The path to doing.
Let me jump in really quick.
Syria is really hard.
The issue that I think we're going to have with this coalition in general is, with the notable exception of the United States and probably the Iraqi regime in Baghdad, everyone in this coalition dislikes ISIL, but they have other things that rank higher in their scheme of values. So Turkey is opposed to ISIL. They don't like ISIL, but they care more about the fall of the Assad regime and more about their own internal problems with their Kurdish terrorist groups than they do about defeating ISIL. It's their third priority. To really illustrate this, you know, the Iranians hate ISIL, the Saudis hate ISIL. However, the Saudis still hate the Iranians more than they hate ISIL, and the Iranians still hate the Saudis more than they hate ISIL. So keeping this coalition moving forward when there are so many tensions and so many other priorities of so many of the members will be extremely difficult.
But Doug, it's not even that. I mean, I agree with that analysis, but I accept that it's not even that simple with the Iraqi government, right? Because with the Iraqi government, you've got a dynamic where, you know, the way to defeat ISIL in Iraq is going to require real collaboration and probably some concessions to some of the Sunni factions in northwestern Iraq. And it's not clear that the Iraqi government right now, although we hope that Prime Minister Abadi is going to go up on this road, believes, you know, prioritizes the fight against ISIL and the reconsolidation of a unified Iraq over consolidating power and playing a sectarian game within his Shia coalition. And I think that's one of the great questions here is where exactly for the Iraqi government does ISIL sit, and is it a high enough priority that the Iraqi government is going to be willing to make those deals with the Sunni tribes? And likewise, are the Sunni tribes going to be willing to make a deal with the Iraqi government? And as you pointed to the appointment of the defense minister and the interior minister, I mean, that to me is still an open question.
So this relates to a question that we received from John Anderson, who asked, could you explain why the Iraqi military collapsed so quickly in the initial phase when this started to escalate? Doug, can you walk us through the analysis of why that happened?
I think we're still uncertain as to exactly why the Iraqi army collapsed so quickly, and for that matter, why the Kurdish Peshmerga collapsed so quickly when attacked by ISIL. I think there are a combination of factors. I mean, obviously, the easiest explanation is that neither of these forces were as good as we thought they were. But a second attenuating thing is that they were positioned and arrayed for a different problem. I think they were neither were arrayed to deal with a large mobile force that can mass power to certain areas. So the Iraqi army in Mosul was in 20 and 30-man units at checkpoints. Well, if you're there 20 or 30 guys and a column of 200 ISIS fighters comes up, you're probably going to collapse pretty quickly. And of course, then that 200 fighters just moves on to the next point of 20 or 30 guys. So I think in some ways, this reminds me a little bit of German blitzkrieg into France. But then there are all kinds of other problems. There are corruption problems in the Iraqi army. There were ghost soldiers. On the Kurdish side, the Peshmerga hadn't really fought anyone for almost 20 years. They were clearly not as good as their initial reputation had maintained. All these groups now are doing better now that they understand the problem that they're facing, and now that they're backed by U.S. air power and U.S. intelligence. Which is not to say there are not considerable problems with both these groups still.
Brian, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I agree with Doug's description of this. I think that one of the interesting parts of this now is that it is the Iraqi government's not reliance is to overstate that, but accommodation and cooperation with some of the Shia militia, both within structures of the Iraqi state, but also working alongside structures of the Iraqi state to generate military power on the ground. It's, as Doug said, there is, an immediate military problem for the Iraqi government that is far more acute for them than it is for us, because it's there on the ground, sitting across the desert from them. But at the same time, that kind of collaboration, working with the Badr Corps, working with the Asab al-Haq, working with Kataib Hezbollah, all Iranian-backed organizations to one degree or another, feeds directly into the ISIL propaganda and their messaging to the Sunni tribes in northwestern Iraq. And that, to me, is the great challenge here, is that the steps that the Iraqi government, or at least some of the steps that the Iraqi government has taken to sort of halt the military progress of ISIL, worsen, to an extent, their political ability to reach out to the Sunni tribes, because those steps play directly into the hands of what ISIS has been preaching for years. And there's no good way to square that circle. I mean, you can't allow, there needs to be, you need to halt the offensive that ISIS has done militarily, force them to try to consolidate power, force them to face the internal contradictions in the ISIS coalition, but recognize that there is a negative feedback loop on the political side while you do that.
Right, and this just doesn't get any simpler. The solutions that Brian is proposing, reaching out to the Sunni tribes, essentially validates, in the eyes of the Shia, their use of these militias. You have your sub-state groups, we have our sub-state groups. This is all fine and good. So it's as we keep saying, the things that make things better in one dimension tend to make things worse in another dimension, and it's going to be a very careful balancing act as we move forward. Because, like I said in the beginning, the things that are militarily optimal are politically suboptimal, and vice versa.
I mean, and this is why when I think about this and how do we get out of this sort of cycle of despair, I really think we need to look at creative governance changes in Iraq and potentially the sort of dissolution of Iraq as we know it. And at a bare minimum, I think forms of radical autonomy in Sunni areas that incentivize those Sunni tribes to push back on ISIL, ISIS, whatever we want to call it, without having to sort of, as they might put it, subjugate themselves back to a government that they are never going to control again, which is going to be a Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. We have to find ways for them to build an accommodation with that government in Baghdad. And I think the only way you do that is by guaranteeing some forms of radical autonomy, and potentially, that doesn't need to mean the destruction of Iraq, but I don't think that we should take that off the table as we think about this over the long run, because I don't see a lot of good ways to sort of square these circles that we're pointing to.
In this context, we received a question from Mohammed Bouam on Facebook who asked about the relationship with Iran in trying to address the problem. Could you speak a little bit more about that specific relationship and how you see that playing out moving forward?
I think our relationship with Iran will be very interesting moving forward. We are in a unique position where in the extremely short term, our interests and Iran's inside Iraq are almost identical. We and Iran are interested in the defeat of ISIL and in maintaining the territorial integrity of Iraq. Now, of course, once we get past those two interests, things start to diverge very, very quickly. But in the immediate near term, there's not a lot of white space between what the United States is trying to do and what Iran is trying to do on the Iraqi side of the border.
And on the Syrian side of the border?
Very different.
Very different. I mean, the challenge here, though, is that there's even a negative feedback loop on this one, right? Where, if we were going to say, what, we need to put military troops on the ground in Iraq to get this done with ISIL, we would start to see the relationship with some of the Iranian-backed groups change very quickly, I think. We would start to see demonstration attacks against Americans to illustrate that they can apply pressure on the U.S. And so this is one reason why, there is the suggestion by some that we ought to put ground forces back into Iraq. And I understand where that's coming from, because I'm skeptical that we are going to be able to defeat ISIS using proxy forces. But if you do that, you're going to start to upset this sort of, I don't want to call it a coalition with Iran. That's not the way to look at this. But this sort of tacit alignment of interests with Iran is going to go away very quickly if you start to increase the amount of American military investment on the ground in Iraq. And we can try to define this or distinguish this from Syria, but that border, I worry that we care about that border more than most of the actors in the region care about that border, including the Iranians.
Right. As Brian says, there are so many things that are the right thing to do or that are true, but that are politically inconvenient to say. So, yeah, de facto, we're in an alliance with Iran. Now, I don't expect anyone in a position of power in the U.S. government to ever say that. Just like, the vice president is now on his apology tour because he accidentally said something that is, for the most part, true about the part that Turkey and the Gulf states played in the rise of ISIL. Although, to be fair, the UAE probably less so than almost anyone else. They might have, if you were going to name names, they'd be at the bottom of the list. But nonetheless, the things that are, it is politically inconvenient for the United States to say a lot of things that are true about this region and about the way things are breaking out right now. And that's just an inconvenient fact of politics until this crisis is over.
We have 10 more minutes, so I encourage everybody who's watching to submit any other questions that you might have using the hashtag ISIL Hangout. And I'd like to next get to a question that Matt Pinksko, who's also a New America Fellow, submitted. He's teaching a course on U.S. diplomatic history at Dickinson College. And Matt was asking, does the fight against ISIL represent a trade-off between liberty and security? And is it a continuation of the drone wars that we've seen in Yemen and Somalia?
I think less so. I mean, it strikes me these are two fights of a very different character. Now, obviously, Brian knows a lot more about terrorist groups than I do, and a lot more about what's happening in Yemen and Somalia than I do. But it strikes me that in those two cases, we are striking based on our interests in preventing a terrorist group from having a safe haven from which they can plot attacks against the U.S. homeland. And that's our justification for those wars. In Iraq, while there's been some talk about the threat of ISIL to the homeland, this is much more about the stability of the region, about Iraq, about Syria, and about all the neighboring countries that this conflagration is hurting, particularly the humanitarian crisis caused by the spillover of refugees out of Syria. The combination of refugees and the threat of ISIL or actual attacks by ISIL is destabilizing Jordan, it's destabilizing Lebanon, it's starting to threaten Turkey. So this problem is one that has to be dealt with because this is a region that we just can't tolerate that level of stability and that level of instability in so many countries at once.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of the base calculation of where our interests are threatened, you know, in Yemen and Somalia, these are places where there aren't tremendous U.S. interests other than preventing these places from being used to base terrorist attacks against the United States. I mean, and of course there are some interests, but they're not, you know, the most critical parts of the world for the U.S. But you know, ISIS represents something totally different. I mean, you know, and this is the amazing thing, that it has gone from essentially the summer of 2011 now, you know, in a matter of 3 years, to an entity that, you know, serious people are saying poses a threat to Baghdad. I think some of that's overstated, but like, you know, but this is nonetheless that, you know, it threatens the fundamental order in the Middle East in a very real way. And you know, if you start to see destabilization in a place like Jordan, for example, which, you know, could happen with a series of terrorist attacks, and you know, you've now got, you know, 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Jordan, something like that. Most of them not in camps, living with the population. You still have a range of other rest of populations. If you start to see a serious terrorist campaign in Jordan that starts to destabilize the government, you know, the Israelis flip out, rightly so. And the basic order that we've seen in the Middle East for the past 30 years starts to come down. And so when you look at what are we doing about ISIS, why are we, you know, confronting ISIS, why are we trying to limit them, why is there value even in the limited goal of degrading this organization, which is, you know, which is a limited goal. But that's why, because destabilization there, it's not hard to imagine that things could get a lot worse without some more pressure on ISIS.
Right, and it's important to realize how quickly this has come about. You know, Brian and I wrote a piece for the, you know, up-and-coming web journal War on the Rocks just last May, you know, 4 short months ago. Essentially saying, you know, no one's talking about this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and it's kind of different. It controls territory, and we thought we had to introduce this to the American public that didn't understand that. Now, you know, no one has that problem today, but you know, in just, you know, 4 or 5 short months, this group has come from a problem that only experts and people who worked in the region were focused on to something that is on the news every day.
Yeah.
Yes. So, Brian, did you have something else?
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and the ability to control territory distinguishes, you know, ISIS now from its predecessors. But I will say, you know, and I come back and I harp on this, and part of this is the sort of lament of the guy that studied the ISIS predecessors when nobody wanted to hear about it. But, you know, an Islamic State was declared in Iraq by what the organization we now call ISIS on October 15th, 2006, right? There was a cabinet then. They released annual reports then. They did public works projects then. They tried to govern then, right? So while there has been this sort of, it's not even tactical surprise, this sort of operational surprise, by the growth and spread of this organization, their intent has been clear for 8 years. And I think that we didn't pay attention to it largely because the organization was severely damaged by the surge and the awakening movement from 2006 to 2008. And so we had the luxury of not paying attention to it. But you could see that this organization was growing again even before the Syrian civil war. I published a piece through New America in spring of 2011 that made this argument. And, you know, and so I think we need to be wary about saying, well, this was such a surprise. It was a surprise because there was not a constituency in Washington that wanted to hear about it. The Republicans and folks that that did the coin campaign very well in Iraq wanted to claim success there. Democrats didn't want to hear about Iraq. And frankly, I think our models for understanding the strength of a terrorist organization that was persisting after it had been an insurgent group were not good enough, and so we didn't recognize the persistent danger that this organization posed, and we should have. And I think we've got to look at that as we look to the future, because that sets the standard that we may feel like that sets the standard by which we determine what our goal needs to be if we're going to limit the danger from this organization in the future.
So we have time for one more question, and this is another question from students at Ballston High School who ask, how is the threat posed by ISIS different than the threat posed by Al-Qaeda? Doug, did you?
This is really more Brian's area of specialization, but I'll take a stab at it. You know, ISIS I think can be thought of as a younger, more aggressive, closer to the street version of Al-Qaeda. You know, the story I always think of that, you know, Brian was probably going to tell me as apocryphal, is that when, you know, Zarqawi, the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq, finally met bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, that bin Laden disapproved of Zarqawi because he was tattooed. You know, he was from the streets of Jordan, had done a lot of prison time, and to me that incident kind of captures these two organizations. You know, one much more old school, you know, the bin Ladens are, you know, Saudi aristocrats, or at least very wealthy Saudis, come from higher society, very tied into a older, more respectable side of jihad. And now the Islamic State is this young upstart from the street, much more worried about just living off its successes than, you know, and certainly while there's a theological component to each, I think that the theological component to Al-Qaeda seems to me much stronger, whereas in Al-Qaeda, it's really the street credibility that comes first. It's battlefield successes. There's a theological component, and it's very rich, as Brian knows better than I do. But it's really their street credibility that drives this organization. And I think that's what makes it more threatening to us. It's more appealing to young jihadi. You know, if you're a 15-year-old, like one of these people I'm talking about, someone with no job prospects, poor, no legitimate means of complaining about the political situation that you're in, no education, you know, whether you're from Tunisia or Saudi Arabia or Yemen, you know, do you want to go join Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Syria or Iraq and join this organization that, you know, even now is still having as many victories as defeats, you know, or do you want to go hang out in some cave in Pakistan with the Al-Qaeda people? To me, that's no choice whatsoever. You're going to go join Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He's the new big thing, and to me that makes them more threatening. You know, we see the exponential growth everywhere they go. Each success attracts more people. I think these beheadings, as we find them appalling, people in the Middle East, I think, are, you know, see this as a show of power, standing up to the United States, executing United States citizens. This has appeal, and I think so long as they continue to have these string of successes, and that's why I think the military campaign is so important. It's not just about defeating the current ISIS fighters; it's about cutting off the appearance of success, so that younger jihadis no longer see them as someone to go join.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think I agree with the gist of what Doug is saying. I mean, you know, Zarqawi, actually, one of the arguments he made, his strongest, you know, he was not a theologian, but one of the arguments that he made in 2005 was that authority within the jihadi community was dependent on your proximity to the battlefield, right? That it was battlefield commanders that had ultimate authority, not religious scholars, which was kind of the argument that Al-Qaeda had relied on for a long, long time. And so, this was how Zarqawi sort of said, I don't really need to listen to bin Laden, but also I don't need to listen to Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, which was his religious mentor in Jordan. And so, I think the larger point from this, though, is that when we think about counterterrorism, oftentimes we say, well, we need to counter the ideology. The ideology is what's recruiting people. And that's not quite right? Because Al-Qaeda, when you look at the jihadi community, the senior scholars still are lining up behind Al-Qaeda. Most of them have not endorsed the Islamic State, the quote-unquote Islamic State and the renewed caliphate, because they don't see it as legitimate on religious grounds. I'm not going to get into that debate. But what's powerful here is that even though they're not getting that support, this is an organization that is recruiting people like crazy. And what I take from that is that what recruits people, what gets people off the couch to go join a jihadi organization like this is the opportunity to live out a mythology, right, as they would understand it, right? The opportunity to go out, and the myth in the jihadi world is still, like the myth that gets told is walking with your AK-47 and your brothers in arms across the mountains of Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, right? That's still the myth. And right now, where in the world are young jihadis living that myth? They're living it in Syria and Iraq. And that's why ISIS is having success recruiting people, because that's what people are trying to latch on to, is that myth. And the details of the ideology and the details of the theology are used to entrench people and indoctrinate people and keep them in the fold once they get there. Get them to be willing to do the suicide attack. But what gets people off the couch? The perceived opportunity to live out that myth. And so I agree with Doug's point here that one of the things that we need to be thinking about as part of the campaign plan against this organization is how do you blunt their military offensive, blunt their success, and then drive home the fact that these people that say that they are legitimate, powerful, ideologically correct fighters are really at the end of the day a bunch of thugs. And this has threatened ISIS and its predecessors from the time when they were in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Foreign fighters would show up in Iraq, they would realize that the guys on the ground were not these mythological fighters that they wanted them to be, that they thought they were signing up to spend time with, that they were a bunch of thugs that would abuse the local folks, that disrespected the foreigners coming in. And you don't see as much of that today trickling out, but you do see some of it, and that's part of the crack. And that's what you're going to see more of if ISIS has to hunker down and really govern, as opposed to focus on the military offensive and live off those military victories. Those cracks are going to start to appear in that organization more and more. And we need to have a plan for exploiting them, which is not easy, and we're not very good at this. But that has to be part of the conception here, and the military plan needs to feed into that political strategy.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Doug. Thanks to all of you who were joining us today. You may continue the conversation using the hashtag ISIL Hangout. And you were listening to Brian Fishman and Doug Ollivant, two experts at New America. If you would like to dig a little deeper, you find more information on our website at www.newamerica.org. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.